Good morning, guys. I am walking back to kind of get ourselves set back up for the next kind of video lesson. So what we are going to be doing today is that next simple solutions. So that's a given. Sorry about that. So it's going to be one every day. But today, let me turn the page, is a little different. It is not about the wind and the willows. So if you have been keeping up with those readings and you've noticed that pattern, we've talked about that. But today's lesson is a piece of informational text. So the pieces before kind of have a narrative feel to them, but what you're reading today is all informational text. And it is where you are reading to learn about a particular thing. Informational text is newspapers, textbooks, magazines, articles, things that require you that you are learning about something. So that's how our text is going to be a little bit different today. So it is titled, What is a PSA? That's what you're going to be reading about today and answering and uploading your questions based on that. Now, our end in mind is still the same for our text as far as what Hatchet is concerned. So we know that we will be identifying character traits by drawing conclusions from information in the story. So we answered questions yesterday, gave feedback on that. We are quickly approaching a test, guys. So if you have the book, make sure that you have your sticky notes in place, that you are ready to go for test day, because you guys know as well as I do how much quicker you get through that test if you already have your sticky notes in place. If you opted not to take a book, it's a whole lot of pages, and we talked about that at open house. So that, like I said then, that is a consequence of not taking and utilizing the book with sticky notes. So I'm super sorry for that, but I gave you the options of what you personally wanted to do. All right, so vocabulary is still up here. It's still the same words. It's still your Quizlets. When you get off, we know that vocabulary will be on the test, always is. Make sure that you're doing that practice every single day, and we're going to go from there. Kind of want to hurry and get to the front of the room because we have a different attachment today, and I wish I had thought of this on day one. Duh, but I'm struggling. I'm learning. We have our attachment today says where the novel begins. That is the title of it. And everything that they are going to be asking you to do with this particular attachment has to do with the setting of our story. And we know that, sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around here a second. Kind of want to get it stable. We know, well, we think we know what setting is. So it's saying the term setting refers to where and when a scene takes place. Okay, so where and when. Think about the setting of chapters 1, 2, and most of 3. Okay, 1, 2, and most of 3. Think about where those particular chapters are taking place. And then they want you to consider where these scenes take place and how this affects the plot and mood. Plot and mood of this section of the novel. Now, plot is the storyline, okay? How does it affect the storyline? What are we learning about the characters based on the story so far at that point? Mood is all about the feeling that you get from something in a passage. What mood is evoked from that, okay? After you read that, have you ever, some of y'all may not, but have you ever read a book, a passage in a book, or been watching a movie, and all of a sudden you find yourself tearing up, trying not to cry? That means that they've been able to evoke a mood so strong, or an emotion so strong through the literature and or the film, that you're feeling what the characters are feeling. So that's what they mean for mood. But what I want to talk about rather quickly, and the rest of this is pretty self-explanatory on what they're wanting you to do, but I kind of want to focus on setting. What do they mean by setting? And I've got my Rolodesk. Be impressed, be impressed. I'm my own cameraman right now. Some teachers are doing all these high-tech, you know, Castify or some other things. I'm still old school, people. I'm doing the best I can, so bear with me. And I may end up having to hold it. I'm that old school. I think I'm going to mess it up. But what I want us to think about, and then trying to do this as close to a class setting as I would, I'm just going to have to hold it. So trying to figure that out without making all these crazy faces. I want us to think about a story arc. And a story arc is just what it sounds like. And it looks like this. Now, the story arc, or the piece of the story arc that this is talking about, is this little arm or leg right here. And this little leg is called your exposition. That's what that's called. Now, there's quite a few things that can go on this line, okay? This is kind of what I like to think your story builder is. This is kind of where some of that plot would fall into play. So one of the things that we would put on this line is your setting. The setting would go there, okay? That's one thing. The other thing that could go there is the time of the story. Is it 1942? Is it 2099? What is the time frame that the story is being told in? Okay. The next thing that we could look at, it may not necessarily be a time. It may be a historical reference of time. Such as World War II. It could be the March on Thelma. It could be something that has a historical bite to it. The next thing that we normally see here is, who are your characters? And so when we think about this setting, it's all playing into this exposition, and it's as well as the plot, okay? So kind of want to introduce that story arc, because we will be using story arcs throughout the year. So exposition is the very first piece of that, and that is where your setting is taking place at this point. All right, so kind of jumping in, I feel like at a quick pace this morning, but it is what it is. We want to go ahead and pick our book back up to page 34. And if you've got a book with you, it is most helpful if you follow along with the book, okay? Because once again, there is going to be a question at the end that I kind of want you to think about and kind of jot down your ideas, all right? So, here we go. Page 34, paragraph 2. It took an hour, perhaps 2. He could not measure time yet and didn't care for the sun to get halfway up. When it came some warmth, small bits of it at first, and with the heat came clouds of insects. Thick, swarming hordes of mosquitoes that flocked to his body, made a living coat on his exposed skin, clogged his nostrils when he inhaled, poured into his mouth when he opened it to take a breath. Sounds disgusting. It was not possibly believable, not this. He had come through the crash, but the insects were not possible. He coughed them up. He spat them out. He sneezed them out. He closed his eyes and kept brushing his face, slapping and crushing them by the dozens, by the hundreds. But as soon as he cleared a place, as soon as he killed them, more came thick. Whining and buzzing masses of them, mosquitoes and some small black flies he had never seen before, all biting and chewing and taking from him. In moments, his eyes were swollen shut and his face puffy and round to match his battered forehead. He pulled the torn pieces of his windbreaker over his head and tried to shelter in it, but the jacket was full of rips, and it didn't work. In desperation, he pulled his t-shirt up to cover his face, but that exposed the skin of his lower back, and the mosquitoes and flies attacked the new soft flesh of his back so viciously that he pulled the shirt down. In the end, he sat with the windbreaker pulled up, brushed with his hands, and took it, almost crying in frustration and anger. There was nothing left to do, and when the sun was fully up and heating him directly, bringing steam off of wet clothes and bathing him in warmth, the mosquitoes and flies disappeared. Almost that suddenly. One minute he was sitting in the middle of a swarm, and the next they were gone, and the sun was on him. Vampires, he thought. Apparently they didn't like the deep of night, perhaps because it was too cool, and they couldn't take the direct sunlight. But in that gray time in the morning, when it began to get warm and before the sun was full up and hot, he couldn't believe them. Never in all the reading and the movies he had watched on television about the outdoors, never once had they ever mentioned the mosquitoes or flies. All they ever showed on the naturalist shows was beautiful scenery or animals jumping around, having a good time. Nobody ever mentioned mosquitoes and flies. Ugh! He pulled himself up to stand against the trees and stretched, bringing new aches and pains. His back muscles must have been hurt as well. They almost seemed to tear when he stretched. And while the pain in his forehead seemed to be abating somewhat, there's that vocabulary word, it's lessening, just trying to stand made him weak enough to nearly collapse. The back of his hands were puffy and his eyes were almost swollen shut from the mosquitoes, and he saw everything through a narrow squint. Not that there was much to see, he thought, scratching the bites. In front of him lay the lake, blue and deep, and he had a sudden picture of the plane sunk in the lake, down and down in the blue with the pilot's body still wrapped in the seat, his hair waving. And he shook his head. Oh, gosh, more pain. That wasn't something to think about. And he looked at his surroundings again. The lake stretched out slightly below him. He was at the base of the L, looking up the long part with the short part out to his right. In the morning light and calm, the water was absolutely perfectly still. He could see the reflections of the trees at the other end of the lake. Upside down in the water, they seemed almost like another forest, an upside-down forest to match the real one. As he watched, a large bird, he thought it looked like a crow, but it seemed larger, flew from the top, real forest, and the reflection bird matched it, both flying out over the water. Everything was green, so green it went into him. The forest was largely made up of pines and spruce, with stands of some low brush smeared here and there, and thick grass and some other kind of very small brush all around, or all over. He couldn't identify most of it, except the evergreens and some leafy trees he thought might be aspens. He'd seen pictures of aspens in the mountains on television. The country around the lake was moderately hilly, but the hills were small, almost hummocks, and there were very few rocks except to his left. There lay a rocky ridge that stuck out, overlooking the lake, about 20 feet high. If the plane had come down a little to the left, it would have hit the rocks and never make the lake. He would have been smashed, destroyed. The word came. I would have been destroyed and torn and smashed, driven into the rocks and destroyed. Luck, he thought. I have luck. I had good luck there, but he knew that was wrong. If he had had good luck, his parents wouldn't have divorced because of the secret. And he wouldn't have been flying with a pilot who had had a heart attack. And he wouldn't be here where he had to have good luck to keep from being destroyed. If you keep walking back from good luck, he thought, you'll come to bad luck. He shook his head again, wincing. It's like if you have a bad headache and you shake your head, sometimes it's like, oh, the pain will be a little more strong or intense. So when he did that, it was a little more painful. The rocky ridge was rounded and seemed to be of some kind of sandstone, with bits of darker stone layered and struck into it. Directly across the lake from it, at the inside corner of the L, was a mound of sticks and mud rising up out of the water, a good 8 or 10 feet. At first, Brian couldn't place it, but knew that he somehow knew what it was, had seen it in films. Then a small brown head popped to the surface of the water near the mound and began swimming off down the short leg of the L, leaving a V of ripples behind it. And he remembered where he'd seen it. It was a beaver house called a beaver lodge, and a special he had seen on the public channel, like PBS. A fish jumped, not a large fish, but it made a big splash near the beaver. And as if by a signal, there were suddenly little splops all over the side of the lake, along the shore, as fish began jumping. Hundreds of them jumping and slapping the water. Brian watched them for a time, still in the half-daze, still not thinking well. The scenery was very pretty, he thought, and there were new things to look at, but it was all a green and blue blur, and he was used to the gray and black of the city. Traffic, people talking, sounds all the time, the hum and whine of the city. Here, at first, it was silent, or he thought it was silent, but when he started to listen, really listen, he heard thousands of things. Hisses and blurks, small sounds, birds singing, hum of insects, splashes from the fish jumping. There was great noise here, but a noise he did not know, and the colors were new to him, and the colors and noise mixed in his mind to make a blue-green blur he could hear as a hissing pulse sound, and he was still tired, so awfully tired. And standing had taken a lot of energy somehow, and it had drained him. He supposed he was still in some kind of shock from the crash, and there was still the pain and the dizziness and the strange feeling. He found another tree, a tall pine with no branches until the top, and sat with his back against it, looking down on the lake with the sun warming him. In a few moments, he scrunched down and was asleep again. So let's think about, what does this part of where Brian assesses his surroundings, what does that tell you about him? Okay, we're drawing that conclusion again. We're going back to that end in mind of identifying a character trait, drawing conclusions from information in the story. So the idea that he's paying such close attention to his surroundings, what does that tell us about him? And most of you are going, I don't know. And that's okay not to know, but it's not okay not to try. Really and truly what it tells me is that even though he's tired, that he's making careful observations of everything that's around him, down to the color of things, to the animals around him. He's making those observations. And then he's thinking back to even what had he watched on television to kind of pull that big picture in together. So he's making those careful observations. That's what it's really telling me. All right, now, this is a good place for us to stop for today. So, you have to do your simple solutions. That's a given. And then you are going to complete where the novel begins, focusing on chapters 1 and 3. So you're going to go back in time. We are currently on chapter 5. I've enclosed those chapters. You really shouldn't need those. I think I did. I'll have to go back and double check. I know that you've got today's reading that's there. But if you need to know about chapters 1 through 2 and 3, you can always go back to the earlier lessons, like lessons 1, 2, and 3 to get those. So I think that's probably what I did. I'll have to go back and look. So you'll need to go ahead and answer these questions, upload those onto Google Classroom for me, so that I can kind of get an idea of how you are having an understanding of the setting of the story. The setting of the story is really important. It sets the stage of what's about to take place with Bride. All right, there's your assignment. Bye, guys.